Hello, I'm Veronique Mandel. Welcome to Scribes and Songsters. My guest on this edition of the show is here to talk about two books that take Windsorites back in time. Craig Pearson is a journalist with the Windsor Star and will talk about his very popular books. We'll also hear music from musician Karen Morand. Welcome to the show. Thank you for being here, Craig.
Thanks for having me, Vero.
So, I have to say, I was really intrigued by the book, and I thought, I wonder if this is going to give me a sense of what Windsor is all about. And it really is a journey through time.
Oh, absolutely. And actually, it's one of the things that I hear about most often, that I just love seeing what Windsor was like back in the day. And the first From the Vault is up to 1950. So it starts sort of from the beginning of Windsor to 1950. The way it worked down is that Dan Wells is the publisher at Biblioasis, and it was his brainchild, and he thought he wanted to do this. So he approached the Star, would it be possible? And they said yes, and then he asked me, would I write it? So he picked the pictures. Especially at the end when we were up against deadline, I found a lot of pictures too at the end, but he picked the majority of them. And he wrote the cut lines, and I wrote the chapter introduction. So I learned an awful lot about Windsor when I was doing it, which was fabulous. You know, this is my adopted hometown. I come from Montreal, but I chose to make Windsor my home. I've been here for 27 years, loving it. And it was great to write about the city and find out how much people in Windsor love reading about Windsor.
I know. And I mean, like you, I'm not from here either. And there's so much I didn't know about the city. I mean, as a reporter, you cover stories and you do some background and that sort of thing, but you don't really know the nitty-gritty of the city. And I found that I now know so much more about the city that we adopted.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, and you're right about the thing about being a reporter. You come out and you don't actually necessarily know about everything. You don't know about the history for sure. And one of the things that struck me most was how important Windsor was to the development of American-Canadian relations. The actual physical border was set with skirmishes and whatnot with Windsor back in the day. And of course, just with the friendship between the two countries, because the Detroit area people came over to Windsor to party for many years. Like, that's not a new thing at all. That was happening way back when. And they'd go to Boblo Island, and they'd come to speakeasies during Prohibition. They'd come to racetracks. At one point, there was 3 racetracks in Windsor. It's crazy. And so it had a lot of entertainment, a lot of fun for people
and
on that side.
Did you find, like, as I was going through it, one thing I thought, there's almost something romantic about that old look of Windsor. I don't know, there's, in the modern age of Windsor doesn't seem to be the same. You know, those big hotels and...
Yeah.
I don't know, there was something sort of majestic about it.
I think that possibly there was fewer options back then, and so when they did something, they did it right, they would attract a lot of crowds. One of the things that book shows, all those pictures, is the level of civic engagement back in time was way more than today. I mean, there are shots of crowds outside the Windsor Star, for instance, on election night. Why? They want to get the early results. It was the only way to get it. But also, just an average parade on Olette Avenue would have thousands upon thousands of people. They would die to get that kind of numbers today.
I know. Even one of the churches.
Yeah.
They had I think it was the St. Mary's.
They had an annual Mary Day parade. You might be thinking about that.
Yes,
and that showed the Catholic roots, how deep the Catholic roots were in Windsor. And everybody knows about the May Day parade, which is associated with the labor movement, but the Mary Day parade was almost the opposite in a way. It was associated with the Catholic Church. It was unbelievable, the amounts of people that they got, thousands upon thousands. They don't have parades today that get many. Back in the day, there was that level of public civic engagement, which was fabulous. I have a friend of mine, a reporter, Trevor Wilhelm at the Star, and he loves those pictures so much. He's bought a house in recent years, and he's fixing it up. And one of the things he's doing is he's putting up pictures from the original From the Vault, because they have that romanticism that you're talking about.
I never thought how Windsor got its name, for instance. I mean, you know, you sort of take it for granted. It's called Windsor, but there were some interesting other names.
Yeah, well, there were a few other names being batted about, and there was Richmond Landing, Ferry Landing, those kinds of South
Yeah.
Detroit, believe it or
Yes,
not, was
South
even in the
Detroit.
running. And but the one that finally won out was Windsor, and part of the reason they said was because it had a regal sound to it. It reminded them of home, all the British people that had come over here. But the best story about that is not what the name became, but how the name was chosen. And it was chosen in Windsor Castle, which was a pub at that time, and a really happening one.
Well, it didn't look much like a castle.
No, it certainly did not. It was just a place with, wood, clapboard walls and those kinds of things. But in true Windsor fashion, they chose the city's name over beer.
Yeah. Don't you just love that about Windsor?
Oh, I absolutely
and
do.
there was a really solid foundation, because of all the rum running that went on around here.
Oh, yeah, 100%. Now, when they chose the name, though, that was before the Prohibition, right? So that came in the
Right.
1920s when the states, actually, Prohibition was at different times in Canada and different provinces, but it was largely in the 20s in the States. And so, yes, that's when Windsor really developed its reputation as Sin City, because people would come over here to drink and go to speakeasies and have a lot of fun. The majority of the rum running that crossed the border came through Windsor at that time. And, of course, Al Capone was rumored to have visited and those kinds of things. But even back in that day, before Prohibition, drinking was quite a big thing, not just in Canada or in Windsor. It was a thing. I think we'd be shocked to learn how much people drank back in those days. They drank if they weren't feeling good, and they drank if they were feeling good, and everything in between. And I think you only basically had to be high enough to reach the bar, and they'd serve you at that time. So, yeah. And when Windsor thought of that name, by the way, there was only about 200 plus people that were permanent residents. There was more soldiers than residents at that time. But yeah, it was a pretty small town when I thought its name up.
Yeah, and some of the other things, of course, Boblo plays a really important role in the book, because it was Essex County's Boblo. It wasn't like a Windsor thing per se. It was in the whole American and Canadian.
Most people who think of Boblo today think of the amusement park, and of course, that was fabulous. But when Boblo first became popular, there was no such thing as amusement park or amusement park rides. It became popular because it was a great place to row to in a boat, get there, canoe around, just walk around, have picnics. They had a huge dance hall at one point.
Oh my, the photo of those dance halls in the big pavilion. It made you sort of wish for that time.
Oh, wouldn't it have been that fun? You go over there, so it's an effort to get there, because you got to probably row over yourself, right? And you get there, and then you get into this dance hall, and it's the place to be. And
I know.
There's probably more Americans there than Canadians at that point.
Yeah.
And then the party just starts with, of course, live music, because they don't have recorded music, and that's a fun party to be at.
And we sort of keep. It's interesting how we sort of keep going back to that sort of romantic, nostalgic sort of feeling about Windsor and Essex County, back in that period.
Oh, yeah. Whenever I sign one of these books, and they've been so popular that I've been blessed to have a lot of people asking me to sign it, I always sign something about, enjoy the journey through Windsor's past, because that's what it's about.
Yes.
It's about seeing it through the people's eyes from that time. You really, those pictures are fabulous. In fact, there's some pictures from even before they were being published in the newspaper, because newspapers really only had the capacity to publish pictures as it went on. So a few in the collection are from a little bit older than that even. I think the oldest one is about in 1860s.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, do people talk about, I saw my family in that book, or I recognize people in the book?
Absolutely. I get that all the time, especially with the second book, but even with the first one, I get people saying, oh, my grandfather was in that book, or my aunt is in the book. I love hearing about that, because people are genuinely thrilled about having their family members in the book, and they love to show it to me. Sometimes they've asked me to sign it by where their picture of their loved one is. And to me, it makes it fabulous when you run into somebody who somehow feels that connected to the book.
Yeah, exactly. Was there anything that surprised you?
I think a lot of it surprised me, perhaps how much rum running was going on. I know we touched about that briefly, but, it was like some pretty big business, including some people becoming millionaires even at that time from it. And, you know, there's a picture in there that makes you want to weep. It's got some detectives and other agents destroying liquor on the riverfront, and it just goes to
People
show.
would have cried.
Oh, 100%. Can you imagine watching that? I mean, most people, I think, would disagree with that. I mean, there was a very strong temperance movement at that time, hence prohibition.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think how big business it was for Windsor back in that time.
And I thought the police section in here was rather interesting as well.
Yeah, well, back in the day when they first started in the mid 1800s, there was literally, I think it was just one police officer to start. You can imagine, and they called him night watchman at that time.
Yes. Yeah.
And then, but pretty soon they started realizing, well, we need more of these guys. And some of the things that they would come across, like they had serial killings and slashings and these kinds of things happening. I mean, they had some seriously bad crime going on. And in 1950, which is actually more about the second book, though, the whole police force practically had to change over. There was large-scale corruption. It was getting national coverage. Maclean's magazine came over and did a big piece on it. And a whole bunch of people were ousted at the police force because of it. And they were basically turning a blind eye to gambling and drinking and that kind of stuff when they shouldn't have been. So, yeah, there's a lot of police stuff that went on in this. Mostly good, and once in a while some scandals too.
Yes, and in that period as well, I mean, Windsor, there was a lot of corruption in the city at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why the police force was largely ousted. And in fact, it almost connected into some of the councillors at the time too. But none of them, they all managed to keep their job. But it certainly was the talk of the town, and in fact the talk of the country. Mm-hmm. That's Windsor.
That's Windsor. And every once in a while you hear somebody say, we should bring back the ferries. I mean, when I saw the photo of all the activity on the river, boats and ferries and all sorts of floating devices.
Yeah, yeah, the river really was filled. I mean, you get it more from drawings back in that day than from pictures, although even some of the later ones have pictures that show that the river was literally filled with people using it. I talk about the romance again. I'd love to cross the Detroit River on a ferry.
Yes, I know.
And there is talk about bringing it back. Who knows if that'll happen? There's a lot of, cross-border legislation to navigate, but I think it would be a smashing success if they brought it back.
I do too. I mean, you could connect the wine tours in this area and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
I mean, it'd be tremendous. There are so many interesting people in this book. And, I'm going through them and thinking, oh my goodness, these are people you'd love to have known.
Oh, yeah.
But I just noticed that the Windsor Star recently did a very good series about addictions. Mm-hmm. And there's a wonderful photo here from 1945, and they were talking about the dangers of narcotics.
Yeah, in fact, as a matter of fact, I believe that there was a recovery home right downtown Windsor. Believe it or not, back in the day, there was a recovery home back there because they knew about it. And it was especially, I think, drink. Alcohol was one of the main things they were treating people for, but perhaps even opium back in the day. I don't know. I know at one point they used to advertise shipments when it wasn't illegal. The opium and heroin shipments were coming into the dock, going down there and get them. You could advertise that in the paper. So it's something that we haven't escaped even to this day.
There's a photo, some folks from the Windsor Police Department examining an opium pipe.
There's a perfect example of it. They had opium dens back then.
Yeah.
Before, that was when they were illegal, of course, and that's why but before, at one point, they were considered, it was fine to have it, It's weird.
Yeah, well, they used to use it as a medicinal.
Right.
Yeah, I know.
So they believe.
Okay, so that brings us up to 1950, but there's so much more to discuss in From the Vault Part 2, and we'll do that when we return from our music break. We feature a local songwriter on every show, and this week I'm delighted to be able to present Windsor songwriter Karen Morand. Now, Karen's work radiates with energy in her live solo performances and when accompanied by her acoustic trio, Bosco. Her songs celebrate the joys and sorrows of real life. Karen was recently here at the Quantum Sound Productions studio and recorded a song with which many of us can relate. And it's called I Love You and You Drive Me Crazy. Here she is, Windsor songwriter Karen Morand.
How did it happen? When did it start? I wasn't looking and you crept into my heart. You always sneak around, you are so shady. But don't you know that I love you and you drive me crazy? When I rise up, it's your midday. The moonlight woos me, I've always been this way. I like to work the graveyard shift, you think I'm lazy. Don't you know that I love you and you drive me crazy? Well, it's a fair exchange to be in love and be insane. We'll take our turns taking the blame, yeah, well, sometimes we misfire and arrows fly. Sometimes our wires cross and oh, we wonder why. The air between us can get so hazy. But don't you know that I love you and you drive me crazy? Well, it's a fair exchange to be in love and be insane. We'll take our turns taking the blame, yeah. When we have given up, we'll meet halfway. This love is bedlam, and we've moved in to stay. Our hearts are flint and steel that start the blazing. Well, don't you know that I love you and you drive me crazy? Don't you know that I love you and you drive me crazy? Yeah, don't you know that I love you and you drive me crazy?
That was the very talented Windsor singer-songwriter Karen Morand. My guest this week is Windsor Star journalist Craig Pearson. In the first half of the show, we talked about his book, From the Vault Part 1. Now, we're going to hear about From the Vault Part 2. This is so much fun, Craig, I have to tell you.
I'm loving it. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. The process of writing a book, I mean, everyone's process is different because whether you're writing fiction, whether it's something in real life, but this is different. Tell me sort of how you did this, and was it different writing part 2 from writing part 1?
Well, I would say that it was fairly similar writing both. At least with part 2, I knew what I was getting into. Mm-hmm. The first one, I didn't realize how big of a project it is, and I did learn that whenever you finish your last chapter, your publisher will add another. So it was one of those things that was, especially at the end, and I kept finding, okay, we need to get this picture and that kind of thing. So it was a lot of fun, but it is a big, big project writing a book. And I can honestly say, the first one took about 2 years to do. We started, and then we were trying to get it a year earlier. And then to be honest, we just couldn't pull it off in time. So we said, okay, we'll let it go for 1 year. So the next one took, I'd say, about 9 or 10 months, the second one. And it was literally like, at the end of it, it was literally like doing 2 full-time jobs. Because of course I worked a full-time job at the Windsor Star, and I spent my nights, mornings, weekends, vacation time, insanity getting this book out. It's so much work, like just to research and try to find more and more sources, more and more facts to put in. And then, of course, writing it and going over it, and then there'd be rewrites going, okay, well, we're not putting those pictures in, or what about this, that kind of thing. So it's a really, really arduous process. And at some points, it feels like there's no light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah.
But there always is.
And what, did it feel like that it was always hard work, or did you have fun?
Well, I had fun whenever I'd finish the chapter. And then I'd look at it and go, wow, I really like this chapter. I love the pictures that are going with it. I like the information that I've found, and okay with the writing of it, that kind of thing. Doing it all, I always felt that, not just with this book, but I've always felt with writing in general, and I've been a professional writer for 31 years, I've always found that the enjoyment comes after you've done it. Yes. There's this, I think, notion with people that, writing, oh my gosh, you're a writer and you just write when the mood strikes you, and then God comes through your words and your fingers, and there it is on the page.
I wish it had happened to me.
Yeah, but I can tell you that it's hard work, and if it wasn't hard work, everybody would do it. And you're just sitting down and forcing yourself, looking at a blank page. I've got to find something for this. I've got to find the information. I've got to start writing it. Okay, now it's not working. What else? Go back. So it's a lot of work, but I love being a writer once it's done.
Yes. Now, you wrote this one, the second one, with Sharon Haynes?
So with Sharon Hanna, right.
Hannah, yes.
Yeah, exactly. So my first book I co-wrote with Dan Wells, the publisher of Biblioasis, and he wrote the cut lines. The second one with Sharon Hanna, who's a completely lovely person. And she actually graduated university with a history degree, and she came in as one of her first jobs, and she's the history researcher. That's not her official title, but at Biblioasis. She just did a great job, as did Dan, just pouring through pictures, finding information. She was a great help with me.
Cut lines are so painstaking, aren't they?
Yeah, and these aren't just cut lines that, say, shot on, Main Street. I mean, these have a lot of information in them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Even if you had all the photos and cut lines spread out, you could see the story.
Yeah, absolutely. As a matter of fact, might seem odd to say, but the first one I actually found more information, certainly more books had been written about the beginning of Windsor than there was between the period of 1950 to 1980. There really was virtually no books, just one or two from that period. Now, I could find stuff in the archives of the Windsor Star, but really, I found that a lot of the stuff I got from our pictures that were from our archives. Right? So she would say, okay, so, what chapter do you want to work on? Let's say it was, let's work on an auto chapter. Okay, great. She'd send me the pictures they have and the cut lines she had so far. She was always making those better as well. And I would take those as a base sometimes in some of the chapters to launch my research and use that as some of the sources for my information. So it was a real partnership.
E.C. Rowe. The book starts out with the infamous E.C. Rowe.
E.C. Rowe. There is I think it's a myth that the E.C. Rowe is in the Guinness Book of World Records for the longest road to complete. Yeah. I don't think that's actually true, but I can tell you it took forever. And it inched along at top speed, gaining like an inch a month or something. And it ran into some snags too. First of all, of course, financial. So it was conceived of in the mid-'60s, but it didn't really get going till, I believe, it was the early '70s. And it finally opened one stretch of road, but it just took so long. And part of the things it would run into was opposition. First of all, it was opposition because, they had to clear out that area where the road was going, where people lived in there. And anytime you're going to do that kind of social engineering, like as they did downtown as well, it obviously creates hard feelings and people don't like that. But in particular with the E.C. Rowe, an interesting thing that happened that brought protesters from around North America was when they were adding a clover leaf at, I believe it was Huron Church. And there was rumors that there was a native burial ground in that area, because there had been some bones found in, not right there, but nearby-ish before that. So they had native protesters from around North America come. It stopped the construction. They had professors and other sort of archaeological types go out there looking for it. In the end, they never did find a burial site or bones, so it went forward. But that's another thing in the long saga of what finally became E.C. Rowe.
It's so interesting to go through the book and see the names, whether it's of streets or buildings, and I found myself looking at them, and all of a sudden, to me, it brought the city to life.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm glad to hear that's the kind of thing we like hearing. And, you know, if I may, the first book actually became the fastest selling book in Windsor history.
And it was a bestseller.
It was a bestseller by Canadian standards, which is, some say it's 3,000, some say it's 5,000. It passed that. It's around 11,000 now. Last I knew, it's probably even more than that. The best-selling book in Windsor history is Marty Gervais' The Rum Runners, but it did have about 35 years to sell. So this one's only been out there for about
You're
2 or so.
doing really well.
Yeah, so we're doing pretty good. And the second one is doing very well as well. So it's exciting. Yeah, I think it makes Windsor seem like an interesting place to be, but I think that's because Windsor is an interesting place to be.
Mm-hmm. It is. Oh, I know, the Black community.
Yes.
Wow. I went through all of those pages and I had a whole new appreciation for how important that community was and is in Windsor and Essex County.
100%. I mean, the African Canadian community was here at the start of when it started getting settled, and it grew into a really powerful force in the community, and it had the annual Emancipation Day celebrations, another example of extreme civic engagement back in the day. And when it got going, they reportedly had as many as 100,000 people coming from both sides of the river, as well as like bus tours reportedly from Germany and this kind of thing, coming to see some big names like Martin Luther King and Aretha Franklin, Martin Luther King Jr., Aretha Franklin, those kinds of people came over here. The African Canadian community was the one that I spoke about before when it was displaced, when there was some social engineering to put the new city hall. So they chose that place to do it, and they had to it made a lot of people have to move to different areas of the city, but they stayed in Windsor, thankfully, and are with us today, helping make the community great.
I could talk with you for another half an hour, but we're going to have to go. Where can people buy the books?
Well, they are sold at basically most bookstores in town, so you could try that. Biblioasis has it, the Windsor Star has it as well.
Thank you so much. This has just been tremendous.
I loved it. Thanks again.
You're welcome. So my guest has been journalist Craig Pearson. His books, From the Vault, Parts 1 and 2, were published and are sold by Windsor's Biblioasis. Also check it out at Chapters and other bookstores. That's it for this edition of Scribes and Songsters. Thanks for watching. See you next time. I'm Veronique Mandel.
We'll take our turns taking the blame, yeah. When we have given up, we'll meet halfway. This love is bedlam, and we've moved in to stay. Our hearts are flint and steel that start the blazing. Well, don't you know that I love you and you drive me crazy? Don't you know that I love you and you drive me crazy? Yeah, don't you know that I love you and you drive me crazy?